Great. Okay. So welcome everyone. We're so excited to have you here this evening. This program tonight is co-sponsored by the Georgetown Historical Society, the Georgetown Conservation Commission, and the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust. My name is Ruth Indrick. I'm a project director at the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust in Bath. KELT is a volunteer-led, well, we have staff, but we depend on our volunteers and our members to help us run programs and host things like this tonight. And so we're really excited. We appreciate all of your support and we're really excited to have all of you here. Tonight's program is going to focus on salt marshes, and we have a couple great speakers talking about the history, talking about how the history impacts marshes today. And I'm hoping that you'll leave here tonight with kind of a new way of looking at marshes when you're looking at them in town. I know when I first learned this information, it just opened my eyes to looking at marshes in different ways. I'll also be sharing some of the work that KELT's doing at a restoration project at Sweat Marsh. So without any further ado, I'll hand it off to our speakers. So our first speaker is Jack Witham. Jack has lived in Rouseck for many years and was the director of the Holt Research Forest. So he spent a long time doing field work and studying local habitats. Jeff Wilson is a marsh restoration professional who's been doing restoration projects in tidal marshes for 30+ years and worked with another group to develop or is part of a team, the Salt Marsh Restoration Adaptation and Resiliency Team. That includes people from UNH, Wells Reserve, to develop this system of restoring marshes in unique ways. And Jack and Jeff, please add anything to your bios that I've missed when you're up here. But I'm thrilled to have them both here tonight. I'm thrilled to have you here, and we'll get going.
Thanks, Ruth. Hello, everybody. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history of salt marshes, but I'm going to start out with some introductory information about salt marshes, sort of talk about the origins of salt marshes, the ecological importance of salt marshes, and then get into the history a little bit. Put a couple qualifiers on this talk. One, I'm not a historian, but I have garnered some knowledge from doing research, and I'm not a salt marsh ecologist, but I hope I can still convey some of the ideas of what's going on out there. So Georgetown has a lot of salt marsh, mostly on the south end around Reed State Park, Saginaw Bay, but also a lot of it on the back river as well. This air photo shows the entire island of Georgetown, and then a close-up of the Sweat Marsh, which is one of the largest salt marshes in Georgetown. We have a pointer here. Okay. Maybe I can use my cursor. One thing to point out, looking at Sweat Marsh, I can't see the cursor up there, never mind. There is at the north end, there's a causeway going across the Sweat Marsh, which will be a lot of discussion about that this afternoon. So how are salt marshes formed? There's some of these slides that have a lot of words on them. You don't feel like you have to read them, it's just too many words, and I apologize for that, but it helps illustrate some points. But salt marshes are formed by an aggregation of sediments, basically. And you'll get a mud layer, and over the years, more and more sediment is able to build up, and eventually you get grasses and other plant species growing. And then as more plants grow, it accumulates more sediment, and the level keeps rising and rising until eventually it becomes what we see today in terms of high marsh and low marsh as well. In this area, this is an area that has been identified as indented embankments, which means there's a lot of sheltered areas, which produces the ability to protect the coast from major waves and other oceanic influences. There's lots of major and minor streams and lots of outcrops to produce the sediment. Salt marsh is a relatively new phenomenon, geologically speaking, and some carbon dating that's been done on some of the salt marshes show them to be less than 5,000 years old. The oldest ones, 4,000 plus years old. But salt marshes are very dynamic, and as we're speaking here tonight, there are salt marshes that are forming, but there are also salt marshes that are disappearing. I'm sure we'll hear more about that. If we want to get very technical, we can look at some of the salt marsh origins. Is illustrated here, back barrier marsh. These are generally behind spits. I would say in this area, the Little River Marsh is probably the only one that comes close to that origin. They're much more common in southern Maine and then further south. Most of the salt marshes that you see further south are back barrier marshes. There's Bluff Toe Marsh, which basically is just at the base of a steep incline, and there's material flowing down, and that becomes the marsh itself. And then the fluvial ones are basically where there's water running, and there's an accumulation of sediment due to the water that is flowing through that. This is a typical salt marsh formation. A mature marsh would be low marsh, dominated by Spartina, and then the high marsh dominated by other species of plants. It can include pans, pools, and then there are plants that specialize around the marsh borders. I'm sure all of you could identify most of those species. Oops. So what are some of the values of salt marshes, and what kind of ecosystem services do they provide? Fish nurseries, wildlife habitat, flood protection, clean water. They actually act as filters to take toxins and other excess nutrients out of the water. They serve to reduce erosion. They're important for our food supply, carbon storage, aesthetics and recreation, education, and they are self-sustaining. They seem to have a natural capacity to continue themselves. Well, this is just an illustration of some of the dynamics that you would see in a salt marsh. Salt marsh is one of the most productive ecosystems in nature. The productivity that occurs is comparable to coral reefs and tropical rainforests. See some of the critters that hang out. This is way too many words. Needless to say, the ecological importance of salt marshes can't be understated. They're very diverse. They help feed the oceans. They help feed us. And this is a system that just is very important to oceanic systems and nearshore oceans. So some of the critters that you can see, dragonflies, even amphibians occasionally will show up. Predatory spiders, deer, other mammals, birds like the cormorant. Lots of other bird species. I'm sure these are things that you all recognize and have seen. Interestingly, in the sweat marsh this year, was doing some field work there, and Saw glossy ibises for the first time. They're a southern species that is moving north, and also saw great egrets there, another species that seems to be moving north. Some other less common bird species that you might see. On the left-hand side is two sparrows. The top one is the Nelson sparrow, and the bottom one is salt marsh sparrows. Both of them are endangered species. Both of them occur in Maine, and the Kennebec River is sort of in the Sheepshead Bay estuaries are sort of the dividing line between the two species and where they occur. And I have heard Nelson sparrows out on the Sweat Marsh. On the right-hand side is a Virginia rail, a small secretive bird, which I have heard at Sweat Marsh. And then the other bird is a willet. If you've been down to Reed State Park, they're fairly common down there now. 20 years ago, they weren't breeding here. There were a couple of pair out on Sweat Marsh, so they are there. So when we talk about the history of salt marshes, we have to talk about the human use of salt marshes. And First Nation people utilized salt marshes heavily, for thousands of years before European settlement. There were gatherers, harvesters, hunters, and healers, all utilizing those resources. And today, they still utilize the salt marsh, especially for gathering sweetgrass, which they use in their basket making. So what's the historic role of salt marshes with European settlement? One of the primary things that they did was to use the salt hay. Early settlers depended on the salt hay. Looking at records in Aroostook, I'm more familiar with Aroostook history than in Georgetown history. Back in the 1640s, they were exporting hay as well as lumber to Boston from the trading post that was here. There was also hunting and fishing as some of the early uses. So when we talk about Georgetown, we can talk about the lots. You have a much better version of this map hanging on the wall out there, but you can see some of the lines that were dividing properties at that time. I think like Aroostook, Georgetown, when they initially divided up the lots, people were given a farm lot, usually somewhere in the 75 to 100 acre range, as well as a salt marsh lot, because salt marshes were so critical to the early settlers that all of the settlers were given salt marsh. The stone wall that you see here was an early one in Aroostook. I've seen similar stone walls in Georgetown. These stone walls persist for long periods of time after the settlers, and most of them represent old property lines, and they're still used for that today. This is out of the book, The Islands of the Mid-Coast, and this is talking about Georgetown. This was Parker Island, 1771. What I've highlighted here are the mills. At that time, there were 4 mills on the island. There's a fabulous display here, and I heard that I missed a talk a few weeks ago about the tide mills of Georgetown. But then there was also the acres in salt hay. This just shows how critical salt hay was to the early settlers, because they listed it separately, and it probably figured into what they paid for taxes as well. And at this time, there were 346 acres of salt hay area recognized. So when the salt hay is only taken from the upper portions of the salt marsh, the high portions where there's paytens is grows. So we'll see some pictures of that as well. Salt marshes have a long history of use and anthropogenic impacts. One study a number of years ago said that 37% of the New England coast, salt marsh habitat along the New England coast has been lost since European settlement. The picture you see here is a postcard that was sent out, the dike in Woolwich, Maine. This is from the early 1900s. And I believe that this is the dike that turned into Route 1 and is now undergoing a huge restoration project that Ruth is helping to get off the ground. So just an illustration, this is a photo from Sweat Marsh, but talking about the hay, how important it was to the early settlers. It was used for a whole bunch of reasons, and real estate deeds often talk about salt hay in the marsh lots that were owned by people. Here's an illustration of cutting hay. This is not from Maine. This is probably from Massachusetts somewhere. Probably tractors and such were not used in Maine because the acreages were so small. They could have been, I'm not sure. But the scythe was probably the primary tool for cutting and removing hay. Just some illustrations of how the hay was used. You see someone hauling it on a barge. Commonly, people would build what are called staddles out in the marshes, and the hay would be piled on those staddles, and later they would go and harvest them. These are just some of the tools that we used for harvesting in the marshes. Some horseshoes that you see there, scythe, sickles, pitchfork, and a large rake. Salt marshes were ditched and diked, partially to provide to reduce the amount of flooded area, to allow them more area in high marsh and greater hay production. We'll hear more about ditching and diking, I think, in the next talk. In our area, there's both marsh meadows, which are large areas that are high marsh, and there are also fringe marshes, which are much smaller, and but they're still very important. Dikes were not that common in this region compared to more southern marshes, but ditching was fairly frequent, and some of the impacts of ditching salt marshes we're still seeing today, and probably the dikes as well. Mosquito ditches were really some of the most recent impacts of ditching have been to fend off mosquitoes, and you can see a mosquito there, and a ditch. Generally, you don't see ditches like that up in this area just because there are no marshes that are large. That was from a marsh down in Massachusetts, and you can see the men with their shovels digging. Generally, all of these ditching was done by hand because it was very difficult to get machinery out onto the salt marshes. They did trying to drain the salt marsh to create more areas for salt hay. But this was very interesting to see this article in Maine Farmer. We were talking about someone from Nova Scotia that was trying to convince people in Maine to do more to create habitat, that they should do more ditching and diking of marshes to create more salt hay for themselves. If you go up into the head of the Bay of Fundy, there are some very large areas of where salt marshes have been converted to more agricultural areas, but that did not occur in this area. For some reason, the farmers weren't that interested in doing it. Some locations, tidal streams were dammed for sawmills flooding the salt marshes. I know that some of the mills up in Aroustic had large areas of salt marsh behind them. And that was where the ponds were created to run the sawmills. I'm not sure what impact that had on the salt marshes, but it certainly must have had some significant impacts. And looking at these posters, I'm not sure how many of the sawmills here in Georgetown were actually flooding salt marsh areas. This was an article that I found that was talking about the salt marsh landscape in art and literature, and talking about all the artists that focused on the landscape in doing landscape portraits and then writing about salt marshes. But I love this couple of paragraphs highlighting the use of salt marshes for illustrations, like the Muddy Rudder restaurant used to have their menu had pictures of marsh hay, harvesting marsh hay. There was a brewery in Newbury that focused on one of their beers focused on how great it was, how it represented the cultural identity of coastal residents. And this brewery is now out of business, but seeing the brewery, the beer, I'm a big craft brewing fan, so I couldn't resist. Another later article that I saw, I mean, this was just so typical of this area in terms of its agricultural usefulness. The soil of Georgetown is not good for Indian corn. Rye yields an uncertain crop there. Wheat is too generally blasted to be dependent on. Barley does very well, and potatoes are produced in great abundance there. Apart from tilling of the soil, however, the land's bounty can be extracted in other ways. Lands are very good for grazing. Sheep are well clothed with wool. The mutton is of remarkable good flavor. The butter made on the islands is exceedingly fine and produced in greater quantities than be expended by the inhabitants. So that brought me back to a nice life back then, and that illustration out of the book. I'm sure that most of you are very familiar with that. To get down to some specifics, I just wanted to point out the Little River Marsh. Kelt has a large preserve there that includes much salt marsh. Reed State Park is there. Inland Fisheries and Wildlife owns property there, so most of that marsh in the adjoining areas are totally protected. But that's often claimed to be an unaltered marsh. And but one of the interesting things is that when you start to look at the history, the ownership history of these places, it's very complicated. And the next slide illustrates that. This was an illustration, a drawing that was done by the attorney that Kelt hired to look at the history of the Lundstrom property before we acquired it. And there are pieces that are missing. This is not even the complete history, but it shows you just how complex some of the ownership patterns are. Now we'll switch over to the Sweat Marsh. This is just a small portion of the Sweat Marsh, and you can see the complexity of the ownership here, with some people owning parts of little islands, other people owning 3 or 4 acres here or there. It's just amazing to see how convoluted these ownership patterns are. And then when you go back and try to look at the deed histories, it's very difficult to follow some of these because some properties just seem to disappear from history. You find deeds that you have one owner and you can never find a deed where that owner transferred the property to someone else. So it's the ownership sort of disappears. I think people just forgot that they owned them, and I don't know how these things happen, but when you start to look at some of the deeds and the descriptions that were written to the deeds, the birch tree that was there in 1822 is no longer there. Some of the oak trees have died. The old stump is finally rotted away, so it can't be found anymore. So I guess we know why. Further information about the sweat marsh. This was a 1973 survey of the Zorek property, and one of the reference points was an old dike out in the middle of the sweat marsh. Is it still there? So I wanted to illustrate some of this complexity by looking at a few of the deeds. But there's indications of there's one of them is an old dike from said tree, so far from the tree. There's another one that refers to an old bridge adjacent to the Baker lot. Then there's references, the big marshes, sweat marshes were called the big marsh because they were so large. There's another reference to a dike, the Hogan dike, so-called. And then in the, what's that one? The salt marsh of Elijah Campbell, and back to the Hogan dike. So, there were references to the dikes in some of these deeds. Another reference to the big marshes, which these were. And finally, I want to end it with just some illustrations of the sweat marsh, some pictures that I've taken. Oops. And I think that's a natural channel and not a ditch because of the curve that it has. So it really is a large marsh. I was doing some bird survey work out there, and going from one end up near Hall Bay to the other end out near the Back River, walking 3.5 miles to cover all of those stations. So it is a fairly extensive and large marsh. Out in the middle of that, there's some little pools. There was an abundance of shorebirds there when I visited one time. This is the area where the glossy ibises were. So it's quite an amazing place. And we'll hear more about it. So this is a view looking out over the Little River Marsh. You can see all the pools out there. But what is the future for salt marshes? We'll soon find out and hear the details of what's going to happen at Sweat Marsh. So thank you.
So I think we'll just hold questions to the end. So make this set. Right.
Nice. Thanks, Ruth. Thanks, Jack. Hi, I'm Jeff, and I work with a team called the Salt Marsh Adaptation and Resiliency team. It's a teams network. We go around and we kind of encourage folks like yourself to get involved with salt marsh restoration, and mainly to make marshes more resilient for sea level rise or against sea level rise. And we started this team in 2000. Well, actually, we started this team in 2017, but we started on sort of developing the restoration model that we teach to people in 2009. And sort of during that process, we've learned a lot about agriculture, salt marsh agriculture, and found out that it was a lot more comprehensive than anybody had realized in the past. And so this is just kind of a presentation to quickly kind of go through this. There were 3 different errors that we can identify that were distinctly different from, the practices were distinctly different. And they had different goals. And then sort of when they were all abandoned, the marshes have started to collapse. And that's basically what the future of restoration is addressing or helping these marshes adapt to the impairments that are left over from agriculture. And so I can figure out how to. There we go. So oftentimes it's really hard to understand what you're seeing out there. So most of the impairments that are created by agriculture were created using the marsh soils. So the marsh soils are about 80% organic matter. And over time, as they oxidize, that organic matter disappears. So what were actually large structures have dwindled down into very small ones. And so the early pre-colonial marsh was in a condition that we call at tide shed equilibrium, right? So it had single channel hydrology. A portion of the marsh was serviced with tide water through a single channel. That single channel was proportionately sized to the area of the marsh. So what that means is the tide comes in through that channel, goes up, floods the marsh, comes back out through that channel. That process of coming in and out maintains the channel size, keeps it from sloping. And then sort of the early period agriculture came in and they put in ditches, and we'll go over in a minute, embankments, small embankments, earthen embankments that were designed to reduce the number of flooding tides that would flood the marsh. And they were said to be able to increase the salt hay yield from 1 ton per acre up to 2 to 3 tons per acre. So as Jack pointed out, everybody's had, marshes because it was very important. And if you could go out and you could put these salt marsh hay embankments in and increase your yield 200 to 300%, it was well worth everybody's effort. And we've recently gotten so that we can actually identify these early period embankments. We'll show you some of those. Later, about the 1800s, the next era of salt marsh agriculture came into play, and that was called the Reclamation embankments, which Jack had mentioned, had a few references for themselves. They used much larger embankments. Sometimes they would dike the entire marsh. And the idea was to close the marsh off from any tidal exchange, turn them fresh. And so they would take and they divided up the marsh in 3 different categories. So it was sort of the outer marshes, which were down lower. And then there were the inner marshes, which is in the central area. And then there were the high meadows, which is up the highest points. And their goal was to turn the high meadows from a 3 ton per acre salt marsh to a 4 ton per acre English hay field. And if they could get it even fresher, they would turn it into a 1,600 bushels per acre of mangel wurzel, which is a fun word to say, but it's a fodder beet that's closely related to sugar beets. It's slightly salt tolerant. And then, if they were doing better, they would get in, corn and other crops, potatoes, things like that. And so when we kind of look out into the landscape, what we see is a fractured tide shed. So if you picture a tide shed similar to watersheds, it's basically an area of the marsh that's serviced by the tide. It's one unit. And when the farmers came in, they took that single channel hydrology, which would have been, say, from one stream that comes up, and then they divided it up into multi-channel hydrology. So all the water sort of, instead of going in one channel, would be divided amongst a lot of channels. And that took the marshes out of what we call tide shed equilibrium. So it lost that balance. The amount of channel area was greater than the marsh area. And so they started to clog if they weren't maintained. And so when we look at sort of the embankments systems, this is what we found. So this is a marsh in Newbury, Mass. It's called Old Town Hill. And this is sort of earlier on in the identifying of salt marsh embankments. And we found, I think it's 52 here. And so when we look out into the landscape, obviously we just read about all this stuff and we're like, are we going to find these? And so we went out trying to find the the structures themselves, and then more importantly for restoration, these systems had named infrastructure on the inside of them. So it wasn't just the embankment, it was a series of ditches that was a systematic form of agriculture. So every embankment had a borrow ditch, maybe a borrow ditch on the inside and the outside. It also had drainage ditches, it had cross ditches, it had a marginal ditch, which forever everybody thought was part of mosquito control, and we'd call them perimeter ditches. Turns out they're from the 1800s. And so when we look out, that's an embankment system. So what was, you know, this tall 200 years ago has basically subsided to being about 4 inches tall. You can see it holds water on the inside. So it has a different form of grass, and it's got the salt meadow hay still growing on the embankment because it gets better drainage. And so here's sort of another look of it. And you can see they follow the borrow ditches, they divide up the fields, they try to control the water, and it's a form of terraced agriculture. And so in some of the other pictures, we'll see how, you know, it starts at the top and then each terrace gets down lower. And so what the systems, the reclamation embankment systems look like when we put them together is you'd have the salt hay out front, and then you'd have the reclamation embankments and the fresher hay up towards the uplands. So the red indicates embankments going out into the marsh that were, you know, probably high yielding salt hay fields. And the blue indicates the reclamation embankments that were behind the dike-sized large embankments and would have been fresh. And the most important thing to notice on this picture is in between the embankments, it's now open water. So there was never any open water during the past, you know, 200, 250 years of agriculture. They were farming all of this. And so once the systems are abandoned and the ditching infrastructure becomes clogged, it waterlogs the marsh, the plants die, and then you get this subsidence basin that holds water. And so we've been scouring New England looking for old photos. And here's one from Connecticut. It's 1917, and it's Leeds Island Marsh. And we happen to have a mosquito control photo from 2006 that's at approximately the same location. So in 1917, we can see the area is still under production for salt hay or hay. And then by 2006, everything crashes. So when we look closely into the photo, we can see some of these structures that are named in the, you know, the historic agricultural literature from the early 1800s. And so we've got the borrow ditches with the embankments. Well, actually, these are the embankments. So you've got sort of the outer embankments, the large main ones, and then you've got inner embankments, which have been let go because these guys are not, you know, hand harvesting anymore. They're mechanized harvest by the early 1900s. And so they didn't need the inner embankments. They're probably, you know, even looking for less hay. They don't need it as bad as they had in the 1800s. And so the pink ones are the inner embankments, and you can see sort of how it terraces the marsh as it goes down. And then for the ditching infrastructure, we've got the borrow ditches in blue, the light blue are drainage ditches that go across, and then the sort of the lavender blue, I guess, is the cross ditches that were the smaller embankments that create the inner embankments that would terrace the marsh. And the purple is the marginal ditch, which carried off the drainage water from sheet flow from the upland, as well as an additional way to drain the marsh. So in the larger embankment areas, the drainage ditches actually tip towards the marginal ditch. So instead of going out to the creek, they drained back towards the upland. And Phragmites isn't an issue so much up in this area, but Phragmites is very common further south. And the largest stands of Phragmites, now that we sort of have a better understanding of the agriculture, we can go out into these systems and recognize that you know, it had upland drainage ditches that flowed down to the marginal ditch, as well as drainage ditches in the marsh that flowed into the marginal ditch. And so it's like a drip irrigation system that's bringing fresh water out into the marsh system. So these frags can sort of survive better out in the marsh and not be less affected by salt. And so when we put them together, you can kind of see how it's a systematic form of agriculture. And then when we look across the landscape here, we can see that it continues. The pattern just goes across the whole marsh. And then when we put it back into this, now all of a sudden, these patterns make a lot more sense. You can see where the embankments were subsided, but they're still a little there. You can actually see additional drains going through here for the drainage ditches, things like that. And so suddenly that, well, it's apparent what happened. And then we'll go over sort of the restoration model that our teams developed to use this infrastructure to actually restore single channel hydrology back into the marshes. And so here's an example from sort of the Barnstable marshes. And we can see that these are the early period embankments. And you can see how they kind of go diagonally across. They call it quartering the marsh. And they worked with the landform, and they didn't, it's not the square pattern that we're most familiar with today. And so these are a couple of examples of the Reclamation embankment system that was installed in the 1800s. And you can see that sort of these are larger embankments that go along the ditches. And their whole idea was they were taking that elevation from further up in the marsh and carrying it along that embankment out the marsh, out into the marsh deeper, so that they could have the same flooding frequency further out in the marsh as they had up towards the upland. And so, and then I'm going to focus in on this area and show you the layers of ditching that we're able to find. So these are all ditches that are there that have kind of disappeared. So some of them are the cross ditches, some of them are the borrow ditches, some of them are the marginal ditches. And, you know, so there's many, many layers of ditching infrastructure that's all on top of themselves. And the big question is, well, where did they all go? And why are they not here? And I'm going to show you that in a second. Oh, so these are some of the, we went into some of the unditched areas, the marshes like Reed State Park that were felt to never have ditching. And we don't find the open voids of ditching, but we can find the impairment signatures, which is basically the way the vegetation turns after they heal over. And I'll show you that in a minute. And so we also found embankments and all the ditching impairments out in these marshes. So we've since gone to some of the other more well-known unditched or believed to be unditched marshes and found similar signatures in all of them. So it's, you know, we're fairly confident that there really were no marshes, especially in, you know, in say New England, that were not put into production. And so this is one of the ways that the ditches disappear, and it's called the obstruction points. And basically what happens if you look at a ditch, you get 100% of the water that enters into the ditch going through in the mouth. And then as it proceeds up the marsh, right, there's a gradient. So you lose velocity. Eventually you get this point where sediments fall out. That starts the obstruction point. And then over time, that obstruction point builds, starts to hold water. And then Spartina alterniflora can actually float its roots over the top and create a layer of sod over the top of that. That sort of that first obstruction point that forms further reduces the flow that goes through the ditch, right? And has the ability to create additional obstruction points. So it kind of starts further back in the marsh. As that starts to grow over, it moves forward as the systems, the sort of the back portions of the system get isolated. And so the official name, the official name for these marshes are a subterranean, I'm sorry, the sort of the subterranean ditch void that is created when obstruction points form and they grow over and then it gets opened up again as a reanimated ditch. In this slide, I guess a little messy, but the slang name has turned into a zombie ditch because it's reanimated, comes back out of a watery tomb type of thing. That kids from UNH. But so these are all the ditches basically that we found. And when you look at them, you can see that there's a lot of these open voids in the marsh that are orientated along these ditch paths. And so that's the zombie section that's coming open. And it has the ability to sort of drain off the marsh as well as accelerate the waterlogging process, create the collapse, which as the pools start to get larger and larger, they start to connect and create like a mega pool. And so just kind of goes over it a couple times, show you that, you know, all these little sort of nicks and openings in the marsh are in some way related to, or a lot of times related to, those subterranean ditch voids. And so these are some of the zombie ditches that we found in the Barnstable Great Marsh, where it was believed to never have been ditched. When we start looking at all these linear pools and things out there, we can string together all these layers and layers of ditching. And so a section missing. We'll get into the, I guess, the restoration model now. And so our teams worked sort of to address subsidence and how it forms, and then sort of get the marsh so that it can take care of itself on its own restoration trajectory again. And then we weave in sort of wildlife benefits, and in most places it's the salt marsh sparrow. So the model that we created is called the 4-tiered model because it has 4 basic parts. The first part is to stabilize the marsh platform. So there's 2 forms of subsidence. There's, well, 2 major forms. So there's the oxidative subsidence trajectory. That's when there's too many ditches, drains down the groundwater. Oxygen gets into sort of the depth of the peaty soils. The 80% content of organic matter is then consumed by soil microbes that would not be able to consume it if there was water in the pore spaces. And so by draining that down, we have what's called planar subsidence over the whole large area of the marsh. It's just sort of like a slow burn off of that organic matter. So that's the first form. The second form is also related to agriculture, and that's when those ditches form the obstruction points. They waterlog, gets to the point where the plants can't survive. They go into decline, and they go into a 4-stage progression of successional decline. And so the first step in the plan is to use a few techniques to stabilize that platform so it's no longer sinking. We stop it, and then the plants can grow from that point up rather than having to make up that lost ground every year that it loses. The second form, or the second tier, is to make the plants really happy, right? So the majority of accretion that occurs in salt marshes is actually below ground biomass of the plants going into the ground. And so we have a measure based on the old agricultural journals that just the salt hay normal yield was 1 ton per acre of hay. That's field weight, dry weight, and that the farmers then increased that yield to 2 to 3 tons per acre. And so when we look out onto the marshes now, we see a lot of those open water areas, zombies, ditches coming up, and just very, very sparse hay growth that is no way near 1 ton per acre. So that's the second objective, is to bring that hay at least up to 1 ton per acre as close as we can get it, so that it's putting all that below ground biomass. So a good rule of thumb is that there's about 2 times greater volume of below ground biomass to above ground biomass. And so that's what will allow the plants to start growing that ground level up based on sort of field research that's been done on impaired marshes that we didn't know were impaired marshes. Spartina patens can accrete about 4.5 millimeters a year, not much. Spartina alterniflora can accrete about 5.5 millimeters up to 18 millimeters a year. So when we kind of track that out against 3.3 millimeters of of sea level rise, it'll take about 60 to 80 years for the marshes to regain the elevation that they've lost through subsidence since agriculture started. And so it also puts increased carbon sequestration, other things, but that are important, but not for salt marsh sparrows. So the next tier is to infiltrate wildlife management objectives. So the salt marsh sparrow, I'm not sure how familiar you are with it. It's been declining at about 9% a year since the 90s. The only thing that's really wrong with its life cycle is that it has frequent nest failures due to inundation or in some cases predation. And so one of the things that our team feels pretty strongly about is that there's a correlation between subsidence, the loss of elevation of the marsh, compounded by sea level rise, as well as a loss in productivity in the marsh. That are two major factors for that. One is because the marshes are lower and we're getting more frequent storms, they're getting hit and flooded out more frequently. There's also research that shows that if the nests are 5 centimeters higher, there's a 50% greater increase in survival rates. So that's kind of a no-brainer. The next is that the salt marsh sparrow weaves its nest in dense thatch of usually patons, but it's adapting to other species. If you're trying to hide a fist-size nest in really sparse grass, it's got a greater frequency of getting found by predators. So that's another pretty logical assumption. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to increase the marsh elevations so that the salt marsh sparrow can stay in the landscape. Unfortunately, it's going to be extinct before that 60 to 80 year period happens. So we have to buy them some time. The first or primary strategy that we're using to buy them time is we're creating nest islands from the sediments and organic matter that's produced during the restoration process. So we're making little small islands, learning how to make them more attractive to the sparrows, sort of is where we are in the process right now. And so we're still kind of in the pilot phases of that. But we know that they're nesting on these embankments because when we look at all the nest data, locations, plotted nests and things, we can, almost always associate them with an embankment or very close to it. So and there's also a lot of research that shows that they seek out these higher spots, like 5 centimeters higher than the surrounding marsh. So again, that all points to the direction of that's a good short-term strategy to help them sort of stay spread out in the landscape and to level off that decline. And then the next tier is long-term management, managing marsh migration. We have to come up with a secondary strategy to allow the salt marsh sparrows to make it that full 60 to 80 years. So the islands themselves, we can't make them too high because then they're attractive to predators like meadow voles, garter snakes, things like that that are in the marsh. So they have to be sort of small and very hidden in the marsh. The sparrows will find them, but they're not attractive to the predators. And when we track that over time, that's about 20 to 30 years. Maybe 40 for some of the higher ones. So we're doing a diversity as we go, but it won't last the distance. So the secondary strategy that we're piloting right now is to actually go into these reclamation embankment systems that are still there. There's a progression of degradation in them. So they start with sort of the plants all happy as sea level rise gets to them, starts flooding them. It's like when you start overwatering your house plants, the plants go into decline, they start to die. If we can catch them in that early decline stage, it's not going to be too hard to fix them and get them back to highly productive salt marshes. So that's a really good strategy. The next few stages after that, it becomes more difficult. So as the plants start to yield to open water, then there's more time and more effort. But we still think based on the elevation that they start as, and then sort of the research that shows the ability of the plants to accrete over time, that we can still, by the time that 20 to 30 year window arrives where the nests are less reliable, that we can have a great portion of the marsh sort of to take over and become more reliable breeding areas for the sparrows. And then, so this is sort of the restoration approach. It's wicked complicated. And you'll see in a minute just how complicated it is. So I'm a forester, right? Forestry, you either suppress or you release, depending on what you're doing. And so in the waterlogged areas, right, we're releasing the hydrology with the use of a shallow channel called the runnel. And in the areas where it is, you know, a deep ditch and it's draining off the groundwater too far, right, we're suppressing the groundwater through a process called ditch remediation. And so in application, you know, this is the suppression where we're raising that ground level to just below the active rhizosphere of the plants. And we just harvest the hay, rake it into the ditch, and stake it down. Forms the best growing medium. You know, you're using the components of the salt marsh that's already there, the salt marsh plants that grow in that growing medium, right? So you're creating this organic growing medium that's trapping sediments that are coming in the water. That organic growing medium is the best medium for the plants. They regenerate salt marsh peat that's almost identical to the vertical soil columns on each side. It's a near perfect match, which is really hard to get in peatland or peatland soils, right? So peatland soils, that soil column was created in what you could call or identify as a biological process, right? The plants are there, they're putting their roots into the ground. That's what makes the soil. Unlike a red maple swamp or a similar wetland where it's a depositional process for the organic matter, right? The leaves fall and they layer over time and the water builds up in that layer, and that's what builds up the organic matter. This is a different process. So you can't replicate the salt marsh peat by filling the ditches and just, you know, sort of walking away. You've got to do that slow, layered, and let the plants do the work. And then the next one is runneling. And basically it's digging shallow, wide channels. And so the shallow, wide channels tend to stay open over time. They move through. You can't see it in this image, but there's a delveg in the middle of it. That delveg is what constantly drains out a little bit of groundwater and sort of maintains the channel as open. Ditches, what will happen when you do the traditional ditch, the vertical edges of the ditches actually create a barrier. So then once plants start to grow in it, or the obstruction point starts to form, then, you know, the vertical edges of the ditch create the clog. And so with a shallower, wider channel, there's more room for meander over time. And what we anticipate to happen sort of as the marshes adapt is the areas in between the runnels will swell, right? So accretion happens, those elevations go up. These runnels will become sort of the low rounding in between high points. And very similar to other habitats, you see that all the time. And then we also anticipate that sort of as the slopes return to the marsh, I forgot to point that out at the Leeds marsh, is that the marshes were very sloped. As the slopes return to the marsh, we expect that there'll be a retraction of a lot of these runnels. So these open channels will be just rounded vegetated areas, sort of sloped as the channels disappear. And then, so this is sort of the large scale application of the, it's down in Ipswich, and large scale application of the restoration model. And so it's 300 acres, 7 properties. Since then, we've also filled in the properties with additional planning and restoration efforts. And so we identified 1,000 agricultural embankments on those 300 acres. And then we also identified 588 single channel hydrology networks that would restore those areas. And so if you can imagine all those ditches intersecting all over the place, what we basically are doing is we're connecting segments of ditches with these shallow runnels. right? Creating from multiple channels, one single pathway for the water to go through. And then we're filling in sort of all the old ditches with that ditch remediation technique that creates the peat. And what we're doing is we're eliminating the alternative flow paths, focusing the water back towards one path that will maintain itself and it'll prevent the clogging over again. Another term for that is centralizing the flow. And so that's the sort of the networks altogether. After you see how they're put together, it's helpful to see them in blue again. And that's part of the team. Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about what we're doing here and how we're using these techniques. So Kelt got involved with this project. So this is Sweat Marsh. It's the top of that picture is Flying Point. Flying Point. So Flying Point Road crosses across the marsh there. Some of you may be familiar with the small culvert that's located at the spot where that orange dot is. It's an undersized culvert there that is very clearly undersized. So we ended up getting involved with this project first because the town road commissioner decided that he needed to deal with that culvert, that it was a problem. And so then we reached out to Charlie and asked if we could work with him to do more at that site, to really like not just meet the town's needs, but also focus on meeting restoration needs at this site. And so Charlie was on board, and we ended up getting some funding for the project to do some ecological improvements. So not just to focus on the culvert, that's one piece of it, but also to focus on this agricultural mediation techniques and partnering with a smart team to do more work on that. So, let's see. So the project area that we're working on, it's 126 acres. So the area in those blue circles, that's all of the, that's all high marsh area. So it's owned by several different conservation groups. All of the area that we're doing our work right now is on conserved land. So the top part is the Nature Conservancy. The largest part of it is owned by Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and then Kelt owns a piece of the marsh upstream from the culvert there on our Zorak property. So you can see where that is in Georgetown, and yeah. So kind of, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the why, and I know that both Jeff and Jack touched on this, but so one is restoring marshes because there are vulnerable species. So as Jack noted, this is a picture of the Nelson sparrow. These sparrows nest in marshes, so they depend on marshes for nesting. And they also, you know, the spring neap tide cycle, we have smaller tides and larger tides. Their cycle of egg laying to hatching is timed just right to go from like the end of one large tide to the beginning of the next large tide. So they usually lose their first clutch of eggs, lay another set of eggs within a couple of days, and then the birds should fledge before it floods again. And so the issue is that marshes are flooding so frequently that these nests get flooded and the young die before they are able to fledge. So these birds are very rapidly becoming endangered, and I think that there are estimates that like they could go extinct, I don't know, 20 years or so. I mean, so that's why like this bird has risen to the top of many organizations' lists of like, oh, we really need to focus on making sure that this habitat is sustained. And just tidal salt marshes themselves are really valuable habitat-wise. The state of Maine has, or Jack talked about some of the values to them. A staff member at Maine Natural Areas Program, I heard a lecture she gave once that said that with sea level rise, these habitats, like if they aren't able to keep up with sea level rise, Maine could lose 50% of its marshes. So we need to do whatever we can to enable these marshes to stay resilient, to keep up, to keep rising in elevation instead of sinking in elevation as sea level rises, so that we can sustain these habitats going forward. And so that's really what this work is focused on, helping these marshes continue to rise and continue to stay healthy, so that they can sustain themselves going forward into the future. Okay, so the first issue at this site that I'm sure most of you are familiar with is this culvert. This culvert is very undersized. You can see upstream and downstream, there are those like rounded areas. That's because the culvert, the water comes shooting out of that pipe. It's just done a lot of erosion on both sides of that. But along with like that obvious erosion that you can see, if you look at that graph up at the top, it's also trapping water upstream. So it's preventing water from ever draining from this marsh. So upstream, it's about, low tide is about 3 feet higher than downstream. And what that means is that parts of that upstream marsh are just always kind of wet. And plants in salt marshes are really sensitive to the amount of water that's there. So if this marsh is not ever able to fully drain, these plants are always, like, their roots are always wet. And that is problematic for their health. That can lead to some plants starting to die off. That can lead to like less vegetation, as Jeff was talking about. And then when you have less vegetation, then you don't have the roots, you don't have the thatch from when the plants die off each fall to help build the marsh up. And so it just starts sinking because the plants aren't growing as well. So making sure that marshes can adequately drain as well as get adequately flooded helps keep those plants healthy. So we helped to do some of the water level monitoring in partnership with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the site. And it was very clear that this structure is impacting the hydrology. So to figure out what size structure would be needed at that site to not impact hydrology, we received a grant from the Island Institute and contracted with North Star Hydro for them to develop a hydrologic and hydraulic model for the site. So this model, they developed an elevation surface. So that's that picture in the left. And then it's a 2D model. So the bottom, you can't, well, maybe you can see it. So it's a lot of little arrows. So this model looks at how water flows over the surface. And then they can do simulations at certain points to figure out how water is going up and down. So our goal was to figure out what size structure do we need at that site so that the high tide happens at the same time and the low tide happens at the same time, both on either side of that crossing. And what size structure do we need so that that they're at the same elevation, so that it's basically that crossing is transparent. So where we're at now is we have that model. The town has contracted with Pine Tree Engineering to design the bridge. And so hopefully that will be done. I think they're waiting on me to give them model information. So that will be done soon. And I think things will be ready to go to permitting within the next 6 months or so. And then we do have funds for construction. So we also did water level monitoring to understand what was actually happening on the marsh surface. So at this site, it's interesting, there's, well, you know where that culvert is, there's all the stuff upstream, and before we spent a lot of time thinking about all of this stuff that Jeff has been teaching, we're like, well, okay, the upstream stuff is impacted from the culvert, the downstream stuff should be great. And then we started walking around the downstream marsh, and I'm like, well, this isn't healthy. Like, there are pools forming. This part of the marsh feels really like jiggly. So what's happening? So we did some monitoring downstream, we did some monitoring upstream, we put a lot of water level loggers in just to get some simple groundwater. And so these hung like 1 foot or 2 underground and just documented what the water level was. So you can see these higher areas where the blue lines are coming up. That's when the whole surface of the marsh gets flooded during a very large tide. The other areas are where then it goes down to low tide. So the bottom was an area where there was, it was in a section of low marsh kind of at the edge. There were no embankments between this area and the channel. You can see that at the low tide, the water is below the marsh surface. And so that's a good sign. These plants are not sitting in standing water. What we saw at a number of these wells, some upstream from the crossing, some downstream from the crossing, was a lot closer to what's shown in well 8. And so that's where during the lower tide period, you'd sometimes get, or like the neap tide of the cycle. So that's that lighter part of the top graph. You'd sometimes get the water level dropping below the surface of the marsh. But during the spring tide part, where the tides are higher, the water flows up on top of the marsh plants and then it just kind of sits there. It's not draining out. It isn't seeping in. Something's happening that's preventing it from functioning and coming in and out just normally. So something is trapping it on the surface. And so the more we worked with Jeff and the more we really looked at this site, we're realizing, oh, it's these embankments. Like the embankments at this site are causing issues that are like causing the water to pool and just preventing it from actually draining out. And some areas were even more extreme than, like, it just was standing water at the surface of the marsh. It never really dropped below that marsh surface. And so that's why we were starting, like, as we looked around the marsh, so our next step was monitoring vegetation. And so all of the green dots are the groundwater wells. We had the water levels measured in the channel on the pink dots. Jack did bird monitoring at the middle of those red dot circles. And then all of the little orange circles were around each of the groundwater wells. And we just did a simple vegetation assessment, looking at, we identified the plants that were there and then kind of did an estimate of different types of plant cover types. And so looking at that, we were able to figure out like areas that sort of like to understand more about what was happening on the surface. And so you can see in that picture, of Dylan standing by a tape measure. So there's some areas where the plants seem quite dense, and then other areas where you'd have plants that do better in wet growing, and they were much more sparse. So those are the pans. Those are the areas where the plants seem to be thinning out. And so we were seeing that in a lot of areas. We were seeing that both upstream and downstream from that crossing in the middle there. And so we're just seeing more of those pans forming. And so it seemed like these embankment structures were really causing some challenges for this marsh. So that was when we reached out to the SMART team, we connected with them, and we got funding for the project, and we've contracted with Jeff to do designs, because I'm just starting to be able to look at these maps and see some of these structures, but as you can see, there are so many out there, and Jeff does an amazing job of mapping these. So he mapped all the ditches at Sweat Marsh. So these are the ditches that are out there. And so some of them you can see on the surface, and a lot of them were just ditches that he was able to identify from looking at different types of aerial photographs, looking at water signatures, looking at plant signatures, and then just kind of knowing information about what types of structures were typically done with ditching. And then he also mapped the embankments out there. And so those orange ones are those early period embankments. And then the red ones are the later period embankments. And so looking at that, it becomes pretty clear, like, well, this is why we're getting standing water. There is a lot of microtopography out there that's hard to see when you're here, like hard to see when you're walking out there, hard to feel with your feet, until you like really dig into what's happening, and really do this detailed level of analysis and mapping. You're going to miss what's controlling water flowing at the site. So it was really helpful to see this. And so here are just both of them together. So this is that mix of ditches and embankments that are out there. And so then this is the restoration plan that Jeff developed. So you can see the blue, dark blue are the and Jeff, if I'm saying anything wrong, come correct me afterwards. But so the blue are the channels that are already there. And then the pale, like that aqua blue color, those are areas that aren't currently functioning as channels, but that are important to kind of reopen and reconnect. And so many of them are areas that were ditches. And so they're probably like hidden ditches below the surface that have gotten clogged. But by allowing water to flow through these areas, it will adequately allow the marsh to drain the amount of water that's coming in and out. The purpley pink ones are in brackish marsh areas. And so that they might not be areas that we reopen at this time. The reason that we might hold off is that sometimes if you like doing it right away can lead to Phragmites. And so we'll just want to be really thoughtful about if we do that now, or if that's part of a second stage project years down the line. And then the yellow lines are the ditches that will be remediated. So many of the ditches have sort of filled themselves in their hidden zombie ditches right now. But, there were a bazillion on them on the map that Jeff shared. So those, if the marsh stays healthy, those zombie ditches will stay hidden. We don't need to deal with them. So these yellow ones are the ones that are there right now, and they're leading to over drainage of water off the marsh. And so when the marsh is over drained, as Jeff was talking about earlier, there's so much oxygen getting in that it starts breaking down the marsh piece too fast. And so the marsh piece breaks down and the marsh starts sinking. And so there's those two things, like the flooding causes the marsh to sink and the over aeration causes the marsh to sink. And so we're doing these two different pieces of work. So remediating the ditches so that the marsh is not over aerated. And so this was, as I've tried to wrap my head around this, I felt like this section, so it's just to the north of the crossing at the road. So kind of between the crossing and where you'd go up the hill towards the Flying Point property. This really helped me to wrap my head around why the design was the way it is. And so if you see, so the goal is to break through all of those little, so each of those embankment squares is like a square that functions on its own. I think at some marshes, Jeff has talked about seeing like waffles and syrup. So it's like the edge of the waffle and the syrup gets stuck in the middle of those little divots, or like a divot on a golf ball. Like those square edges are trapping the water. So the remediation needs to cut through those square edges. And so the blue line was a ditch in the past. It's clogged itself, and so that's the ditch. And then it's both like that, both sides of that ditch will be opened up to allow that area to drain, and so to cut through those squares. Then this section in the middle, this ditch in the yellow, is just an extra one. That's not needed. That, like, if that wasn't there, things would still be able to drain. So that's over aerating the marsh. That yellow one gets remediated. And then you can see the darker blue one further up. That one's functioning as it should and allowing that area to drain. But there is still some sections above it where you can, like those kind of darker pooled sections just above it, where you can see that that's kind of a sign of the water not draining out. And so then there just needs to be a ditch cutting across those squares to again allow it to drain. So it's a really thoughtful design, looking at, and the first step is really making sure you know where those embankments are, know where the old ditches are, so that you can remediate it in a way that allows it to adequately drain out and cuts through the areas that currently are just ponding water. And that's it for us. And so we're open for questions. And I guess before that, there are two things I want to mention. One is when we get to the point where we are remediating ditches, I think that we'll need volunteers to help with that process. So I'll be putting out a call. And then the other thing is it can be helpful to see this. And so we're doing a walk out at the marsh on Saturday. Because there isn't a huge amount of parking out there, I'm keeping it to 15 people. I don't think we have a full sign-up list yet. So there's a sign-up sheet out there. If it ends up filling up, maybe we'll do another walk in the fall. But if any of you are interested in going for like just an hour walk on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. to just kind of pull out some of the maps, feel with your feet what these things look like, kind of get a better look at some of the different types of plants and how they're distributed. Be great to have you join us on Saturday. All right, questions? Yeah.
Any of you have comments about the DOT project and what that's doing to the north and the north side?
Yes, so I can talk about that one. So the DOT project is a salt marsh restoration project. So they're doing a couple pieces there. There are three different pieces to that effort. The first is that old 1,000-foot bridge right below Taste of Maine needed to be replaced. So that's kind of what kickstarted DOT's work on the effort. They got a large grant for that. While they were doing that, Kelt collaborated with DOT and got a grant to focus on resilience in that section of the marsh, or on that marsh there. And so we worked with DOT. We had a detailed hydrologic and hydraulic model completed of the site. We did water level monitoring, vegetation monitoring, bird monitoring, and identified what would be needed. So the opening sizes that would be needed to allow for unrestricted flow there. Because right now you've got the town road as a barrier and you have the state road as a barrier. So they also looked at sea level rise maps and figured out how much higher they'd need to raise. Maine set up its Maine Moat Weight, and so the plan, as a part of the Maine Moat Weight Climate Action Plan, the state is now aiming to plan for at least 4 feet of sea level rise. So the section that you see just the left of where everybody's driving right now, just north of that, where it's really high sediment, what they're doing there is they are preloading the roadbed. So that was the old roadbed. It's going to be raised 4 feet. But if you dig down underground, so there was a geotechnical survey done of that site, it's like 100 feet of marsh mud. And so the problem is that if you put 4 feet of road pavement on top, it would just sink. And like in that first year, it would sink a foot or two. And they just could not even keep up with paving for that. And so a technique that they use is preloading it. So they put all that sediment on, it's sitting for a year and sinking. And then they will, the road isn't going to be quite as high as all of that there, but it will be 4 feet higher than the lowest point of the road was before, back when it was flooding somewhat regularly. So along with that, they're replacing the 1,000-foot bridge. And when they got those 1,000-foot bridge designs in, the project came in under budget, which was amazing. And so DOT was able to add into that project that section of raising the road. And they were also able to add in that spot where the water kind of puddles on the eastern edge. They're putting in an 85-foot bridge there. So that's going to really open up the channel there. And so then the last stopper in the plug is the town road. And so Kelt and the town of Woolwich got some engineering designs that the town voted to discontinue their road. So they are going to, George Wright Road is going to end on the side of the Tidal Creek there. And there's going to be like 100-foot wide tidal channel, 150-foot wide tidal channel there. The town's boat launch is going to be moved to the other side. So to the town side, not the side, you won't have people entering and exiting in the middle of those two hills, which was not super safe. As a result of that, the town qualifies for the stoplight at Quasit Road. And so for the town, they get their boat launch in a new location, and they get this stoplight. So now that it's much safer to cross it in Quasit Road. Anyway, lots of pieces to that project. But the goal for restoration is that with that new opening at the town road and the larger state bridge, there will be full drainage of that marsh. It'll have a natural hydrology again. So we're really excited about that project. The state project was fully funded. We've received full funding for the work on the town piece. And it's well, we have designs now, and are just about ready to go for permitting, to start moving that forward. The work on the state road, I think, is expected to wrap up 2025, 2026, and I think that's when their funds expire. And ours is about that same timeline. So by the end of 2026, I think the work should be done.
Thank you for all the information. I'm glad that we can buy a rock from there. Thank you about all this stuff. My question is I understand this in the context of the last 250 years of agriculture from that perspective, utilizing the salt marshes, but I'm surprised not to hear more about fish species and fish habitat in the marshes, because that's simple understanding because they're so important. Everything for that sea. So how do we know that filling in ditches and eliminating some pools and so on? Is there a clear understanding of what the needs of the fish species are? With full understanding of trying to protect the sparrow as well.
Yeah, so a lot of like the way marshes look today are like it's a real symptom of this agriculture. And so for fish species, there are the considerations about, I guess, access is the biggest thing. So if there are barriers like a tidal channel or like an undersized culvert, right now that water flows through so fast through that culvert under Flying Point Road that it's almost unsafe for fish to travel through. You might not have enough fish traveling through. So increasing culvert size is going to make it a lot easier for fish to travel through that structure and to travel into the upper marsh. In terms of pools on the marsh surface, I think the problem is that you don't just get a pool on the marsh surface and then it sits there as a pool and is a pool forever. What ends up happening, and maybe this was the part of your slide that was missing, but what ends up happening with these pools is that they end up getting overfull, and then they kind of burst through the edge of the embankments and they drain out. But after they've done that, so imagine the embankments are around the edge, and then you get a pool forming in the middle, and then that pool is there for a number of years. The plants have died, and so the marsh surface sinks a lot right under that pool. Then you get enough water in that pool, it bursts through the embankment and kind of drains out. So now you've got this drained pool that has drained through sort of natural process, but the elevation is so much lower that it's no longer this healthy high marsh habitat. It turns into this low marsh, and it has a hard time rebounding and getting back. Like, you may have just lost marsh at that site forever because it sunk so much it can't build itself back up to being a healthy high marsh. It ends up being like the sort of marsh that you get with like thicker stemmed grasses right at the edge of the channel. And so if you don't do this work to remediate the marshes just end up sinking and you end up losing marsh. And so it's pool by pool. There may be some pools that like there are places where I think pools are helpful for things like mummy chugs, but paying attention to this connected hydrology is really important for just ensuring that you don't get these large mega pools forming that then cause the marsh to collapse. Do you want to add anything to that, Jeff?
Sure. So there's a couple of considerations that would apply here. One is that we're not targeting pools or open water on the marsh. What we're doing is we're establishing a framework, and then the marsh builds off of that. So there still will be pools, there still will be small areas of the marsh. They just won't get oversized and go through that big subsidence and collapse process. The other consideration is that there's an abundance of species, of fish species that use the marsh, right? but very few of them actually use up on the surface of the marsh and up into these pools. The majority of them are kind of using the marsh as a spatial nursery, escaping predators. They ride up on the tide and then they back out. With it, the species that are up in these pools, like mummy chugs, sticklebacks, sometimes you can have silver sides. They're kind of there by default, they're not dependent on those pools. And so, even in the case of mummy chugs, which is the most common fish that you see up in these pools, they breed along the channels in the vegetation. And then sort of they are, you know, they walk, they feed on the surface of the marsh. And if there's a pool or something, sometimes they'll end up in that pool. Or they'll use, you know, their larval will use the pool. But it's not really there. They're using it as a habitat practice to keep there is useful for them. So we would expect that the marsh overall will benefit from sort of establishing this framework and then allowing it to grow and maintain itself as opposed to the collapsing process that we described.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time flying over the marshes, and sometimes when I look down at what I think is a healthy marsh, it looks like circulatory system in the lung, like one main artery and an arteriole branching off of it. And is that the sign of a healthy marsh?
It's hard to really visualize sort of the density of the channels that you're referring to. So as a framework, and when we look at the framework, you could very well describe it as a circulatory system, or you know, the airways in your lungs, but it wouldn't have a great density. So it would be kind of proportionate to the size of the marsh. So the number of channels, it's a concept called Padgett equal. So the size and number of channels are in a relative ratio with the area of the marsh, so it's balanced.
Yeah.
I just want to leave that off that like now, I mean, so many of our marsh systems at the top are like from this area and around are in fact like heavily altered by human activity. What are we using as a benchmark for a healthy marsh?
We don't know.
So
That's what I say. You know, for a long time, we thought we did it, 30 years. And, you know, it's turned into now we have to go back to the science where conceptually what should, you know, a lot of that is kind of using that. The other information that we use is now that we've identified sort of these successional patterns in the salt marsh, we can then find areas that have restored themselves and use that as our reference. But, you know, originally it was like, all right, what's a marsh supposed to look like?
Yeah.
And now that we know that there are none.
yeah, so it seems like, I mean, the way this process, my understanding of this process of restoration, the way it works is less, let's try to get back to this historic vision of what a marsh looks like, and more, let's try to get our marsh surface stable. And what do we need to do to get the marsh surface stable? And so that's based on more of an understanding of like how the marsh functions and less of like, well, let's make this marsh look like that marsh that's healthy or like in such and such a place. Yeah.
On the whole baseline, which made the shellfish we in the screen and the time screen. So my question is, that the addition of the color, is there going to be less water flow in that stream or more? Coming out of the marsh, that will be more, once the marsh is draining over time, will be more water and very minimal water.
Well, the modeler could probably answer that. I'm just trying to work through it in my head. Do you know?
So I think it'd be more balanced.
Yeah.
So the flow will come in, it's not necessarily more flow. The marsh, the marsh, the vessel fills. It either fills through the channels or the sheet flow as it goes over. So what we usually find when we restore tidal restrictions is we reduce the period of flow. So water will come in during that sort of 6¼ hour period and then go up. And not be extended for longer periods of time as it tries to make up for the imbalance of the flow. That really answers the question, but if the water will come in and out in a shorter period of time. Then I'd say like after
And so yeah, that might change a little bit because right now, the timing of, let me see if I can go back to that one. The timing of the low tide upstream, like it doesn't reach, it's slower to reach its lowest point upstream, like an hour or two slower than. Yeah, so it's, so this, like, you can see the low point on that yellow, that's downstream from the crossing. And then the low point on that blue, like, is upstream from the crossing. And so that, until that blue starts shooting back up again, I mean, that's what, an hour or two of time, that water is still gushing out of that culvert because it's still an outgoing tide upstream. And so it's not until the tide starts coming in significantly that upstream actually starts flowing like an incoming tide. And so right now you're getting water flowing out of that culvert after low tide, and it should all go out at low tide once that crossing is gone. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about this? So is it fair to assume that Jack referenced the issues that part of that process, which I assume is resolving the problem they created themselves by creating the water. When the mosquitoes, there's mosquitoes here. So as you do this sort of, and now we are live with the issue of there being lots of things. So through this work, is it likely that it's a more natural flow that happens about this remediation of our mosquitoes? Am I asking you?
I don't know. Maybe a little bit. Like, so. Yeah.
What we found is that the majority of the high concentration always right up against the embankments, right? So they dug a ditch there as the borrow ditch, vegetated over. As the pool starts, or the enclosure starts to flood more frequently, that's the first area that holds the water. That's the first area that starts to collapse. And the breeding happens over there. And so typically what we found in projects where we even did this is the breeding of the and we're just, preventing that pooling of water, those little pools where the fish can't get to, things like that. And that's where the breedings typically come out. And speak of this location.
You're not going to make any promises.
All right. Well, so far, we're doing pretty good.
Yeah.
Are there new marshes forming anywhere in New England because of sand barrier beaches or things that would serve as ecological references for this kind of work that haven't been impacted by agricultural practices?
Very few. So the one that's frequently looked at is Chapel Flats down in the Newbury Mass. And it's been vegetating for a long 20, maybe 30 years. So it used to be a really popular clamming flat, and the thoughts were that that clamming activities, shellfishing activities, stop the grasses from growing there. Now it starts to go back across. What we find in terms of, but that's a low marsh, and so there's two major distinctions. The low marsh gets flooded every day. And then the tide has to come in and out. And so in order to do that, there's more or greater channel density or frequency of channels than there is in the high marsh. Typically gets flooded either twice a day, once a day, or no times a day, depending on the time of the period of the monthly lunar cycles. And so the required the necessary channels, the density is less. And so, but you're on the right track because what we could use or what we use to sort of identify the frequency and the densities, two different measures for the channels are in locations that sort of the marsh has subsided, mega pools reached open, and then it goes through a period where the channels are unstable. And so it, you can imagine the subsidence occurs, the water body forms, it reaches, when it comes, the water all drains out, it leaves all these ditch patterns that are now exposed, the zombie ditches coming back. Over a period of time, the plants start to grow. And so when the plants are growing well, they push the channels into alignment. And so over a period of time, they actually form the frequency and the pattern that that then stabilizes over time. And that's what we use for the reference.
And Jeff, you had talked about this site having an example of
Yeah.
that.
Yep.
It's so, yeah, so the area,
because I don't know about it. So this area here, right, went through sort of a lot of that subsidence and successional trajectories and is establishing those stable patterns now. It's been long enough that the patterns are starting to stabilize. And so we were able to use this area sort of as the reference for the rest of the marsh, most of the marshes in this area.
So just a quick follow-up then, so you're kind of doing something that accelerates this process, you're learning from this natural process. So,
Yep, that's exactly what we're doing, and I should have explained that too, that's a really good way to look at it. So, you know, it's natural succession, right? So natural succession is you have a field that's barren, it grows grass, eventually shrubs come in, it's predictable, you can time it. Salt marshes go through that same secondary succession now that agriculture is being. So we can look at these patterns and we say, oh, you know, once the ditches disappear, then the vegetation goes into decline. You can look into the marsh and say, see all these little spots of decline. And then you can say after decline, you start to get open water. These pools start to form. You can look into the marsh and see all these different spots with all the open water. And then we find areas where they breached, the patterns are stabilized, they're rebedded, right? So that's sort of the last stages in that succession. Now, the reason it took us a mere 40 years to understand that is because unlike a forest system or other landscapes where you have sort of the whole area going through it at the same time, really patchy in salt marshes. So what our goal to do is to identify what stage in succession that each portion of the marsh is in, and then we intersect that trajectory and stabilize it in single channel hydrology using the appropriate. And so what we're doing is we're advancing that process and skipping the collapse.
All right, I think that's it for the evening. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and